You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so,
Yali no Chime, and welcome to Tales from Aztlantis, the show where we explore Mesoamerican pseudo-history, New Age nonsense, and other stories of adventure. We are your hosts, Kurly Tlapoyawa
and Ruben Arellano, also known as Tlacatecat.
Episode 3, New Mexico has a Hispano-white nationalist problem. When you hear the phrase white nationalist, the sad image of an angry young skinhead toting a Nazi flag and snapping out the fascist salute may come to mind. But here in New Mexico, we have a brand of white nationalism rooted in Hispano identity. And while the people promoting this ideology may look very different from the angry skinhead, their objectives are no less dangerous. So, what is a Hispano white nationalist, you might ask? The ideology that drives Hispano-white nationalism is rooted in the false historical narrative that New Mexicans are directly descended from Spanish conquistadors, and that New Mexico has a unique, distinctly Spanish, not Mexican, cultural inheritance. Those that promote this confused ideology will recoil in disgust at the very idea of being called a Mexican, and will be quick to respond to such an accusation with, "I'm not a Mexican, I'm Spanish." Of course, this is ridiculous, but ideologies based on racial fantasy seldom make sense. You see, New Mexico's Hispanos view themselves as white Spaniards who just so happen to mix a little bit with indigenous people, not as a mixed blood indigenous people who maintain cultural practices rooted on this continent for thousands of years. The distinction is important, as Hispano identity is firmly rooted in whiteness, while Chicano identity is an open declaration of indigenous pride. In other words, one identity prioritizes a European worldview, while the other celebrates an indigenous cultural inheritance. And while Hispanos may pay lip service to this indigenous ancestry by claiming to be mestizo or mixed blood, it always comes from a position of whiteness, and almost always as an excuse for their racism against New Mexico's indigenous people. Well, how can I be racist? My great-grandmother was a Pueblo Indian, you'll often hear. A perfect example of this twisted ideology can be found in the following Facebook post.
We, the descendants of our Spanish immigrant ancestors, are not sorry for exploring the New World, stopping the Aztec practice of human sacrifice, bringing the horse, cattle, sheep for wool, oranges, grapes, wine, and arid farming techniques, etc. Stopping slavery from being allowed in territories we controlled, loving the indigenous natives of the Americas enough to marry and have children with them that led to our shared Spanish, Mexican, and mestizo Indio culture.
What a bunch of horseshit. Hispanos position themselves as white Spaniards first and foremost, and see the brutal conquest of Mesoamerica and the American Southwest as completely justified. Sure, the Spanish raped, enslaved, and murdered people, but hey, now you have wine. Some will even go so far as to deny that the Spanish committed any atrocities against indigenous people at all, and that such claims are lies meant to disparage their ancestors. The stark similarities to Holocaust denial should not sit well with anyone. Recently, two prominent statues of Juan de Oñate, a Spaniard who was found guilty of acts of brutality against the Acoma people and exiled for life from New Mexico, were taken down after much protest. This enraged New Mexico's Hispano community, who saw this as a direct assault on their European heritage. And while a final decision has yet to be made regarding the fate of these statues as of this recording, Hispanos are demanding that they are erected once again. So, how did New Mexico get to this point? What prompted Nuevo Mexicanos to reject their mixed blood indigenous heritage and embrace an identity based on a European self-image? The answer lies in a racial fantasy concocted shortly after the US-Mexican War. When the United States forcefully acquired the modern Southwest from Mexico, the newly taken land came with the people who lived on it. Lots of them. Overnight, Mexican citizens of mixed indigenous blood, along with Pueblo and Plains people who had lived in the Southwest for millennia, were placed in a state of limbo. America now had a Mexican problem. In the years following the war, Mexican Americans were commonly referred to as half-breeds and mongrels by an Anglo-operated press that viewed them as the enemy. As historian Mark Reisler has pointed out, the perception of Mexican Americans in the American mindset stressed a dual theme.
The Mexican's Indian blood would pollute the nation's genetic purity, and his biologically determined degenerate character traits would sap the country's moral fiber and corrupt its institutions.
In an attempt to overcome their status as half-breed Indians, Nuevo Mexicanos rejected their indigenous heritage outright, and the image of the noble Spanish explorer was elevated as the source of their identity. By glorifying Spanish colonialism and adopting a Spanish-American, i.e. white European, view of themselves, New Mexico's mixed-blood indigenous inhabitants were allowed to redeem their ethnicity by recasting themselves from dirty, disreputable Mexican Indians into noble Spanish explorers. This transformation from racially inferior half-breed Indians to Spanish elites helped assuage Anglo hostility towards New Mexico's mixed-blood character, and New Mexico was eventually granted statehood in 1912. As historian Charles Montgomery observed,
Spanish American took root in New Mexico only because of the territory's unusual balance of power. The term became embedded in everyday conversation only because it served the interests of both Anglo and Spanish-speaking leaders to propagate it, to spread it from newspaper editorials, to party conventions, to political meetings of the smallest towns. What made the term so popular was its malleability. In the eyes of Spanish-speaking politicians and newspaper editors, Spanish American evoked both a proud Spanish colonial past and an elusive American future, a future in which they might still realize the promise of equality amid Anglo intolerance.
Of course, this did not completely eliminate Anglo's perceptions of Mexicans and Mexican Americans as an indigenous threat to the American way of life. While discussing the Mexican problem for the Journal of Foreign Affairs, nativist author Glenn Hoover said the following:
More Indians have crossed the southern border in 1 year than lived in the entire territory of New England at the time of Plymouth settlement. This movement is the greatest Indian migration of all time.
Such attitudes prompted the freshly minted Hispanos of New Mexico to deny their indigenous blood even more vigorously and to demand that they be viewed as white. At a rally held in the town of Las Vegas, New Mexico, in response to a newspaper article, poet Eusebio Chacon declared,
The sense of said article is that we Spanish Americans are a dirty, ignorant, and degraded people, a mix of Indians and Spaniards. I am a Spanish American, like the rest of you who listen to me. No blood runs through my veins other than the Don Juan de Oñate brought, and the one later brought by the illustrious ancestors of my name.
This level of self-hatred and erasure of one's own indigenous past in exchange for white privilege is both heartbreaking and tragic, especially when you consider that Oñate's wife was of Aztec or Mexica nobility, and his son was the great-great-grandson of Moctezuma Xocoyotzin. This call for white Hispano identity was echoed by politician Antonio Lucero, who in 1915 stated,
Spanish Americans belong to the Caucasian race. If there is a trace of the Indian among us, it is so slight and so rare as to prove the exception rather than the rule. We are not only Caucasians, but we belong to that branch of the white race, the Aryan, which more than all other has made the history of the world. Ours is a past that can take its place in that grand procession of greatness that is no more, a past to be admired, honored, and reverenced.
Again, a douchebag. Sadly, in their struggle to be viewed as equals by Anglo newcomers, the Hispanos of New Mexico were robbed of their true ancestry. A rich heritage of Pueblo, Plains, and Mesoamerican cultural inheritance was wiped clean, even if in name only, and replaced by a racial fantasy deeply ingrained in the minds of many Nuevo Mexicanos and reinforced through years of pseudo-historical indoctrination. It's time to do away with this harmful, hateful racial myth. So, when I first moved to New Mexico, so my family was part of the group that helped settle New Mexico. They arrived as reinforcements to Oñate's colony. And my ancestors that arrived were heavily mixed, heavily like straight up Mexicas and Tlaxcaltecas from central Mexico, right? Who mixed with quote unquote Spaniards who by that time were already mixed blood themselves. So they arrive, and that's how my family got here. And then my family eventually moved up to Southern Colorado where I was born. But when we moved back, I remember distinctly, man, I was waiting for the bus with this other kid. It was just the two of us. We were waiting for the bus to go to school. And the kid asked me what my name was. And he's like, what is that? What are you? I said, I'm a Chicano. I'm Mexican. And this kid looked at me with this, I'm not shitting you, this look of disdain and horror.
Was this in Pueblo?
No, this was here. This is when we moved here to New Mexico. This was like one of my first experiences going to school. And I didn't know how to take it, right? Like I grew up a child of the Chicano movement. Like this was something I was very fiercely proud of.
Well, the Chicano movement also existed in Albuquerque, so that's kind of strange.
Yeah, right. Big time. It was big here. So it is weird. And I remember him saying, well, my name, and I don't even remember his name. He's like, well, my name is such and such, some Spanish name. And he's like, it's Spanish, not Mexican. And I was like, that's really weird, bro.
Growing up as a teenager, I used to love going to the library, my interest in history and, trying to research my ancestry, my culture, etc. Growing up here in Dallas, led me to a lot of interesting materials, reading materials about, not only just Mexico, but that's what introduced me to the Chicano movement, the history of it. And I remember reading about the Hispanos. And I think the first time that I ever read about that was in Acuña's book, Occupied America, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this idea of the fantasy Spanish heritage. So early on, I was aware of it, but living in Dallas, I had no context as to what that really meant. It wasn't until I went to the Army. I was active duty for 3 years, and in the Army, I met a guy who was I think he was from Bernalillo. I distinctly remember him telling us that he was his last name was Castillo too. And then, in the Army, a lot of people don't know this, but maybe it's changed now over the years. This was back in the late 90s. And it was very cliquish. All the raza stuck together, all the Chicanos and Mexicanos, all the Boricuas stuck together, all the African Americans and, the whites. I mean, you had some intermixture here and there, but for the most part, it was very cliquish. And I remember this dude, we were hitting him up, like, hey, what's up? Because he was new and like we wanted to know who he was and his background. And he seemed a little bit kind of like standoffish, because we were very proud. Back then, it was very common to see a lot of raza waving Mexican flags. And you remember that back in the day, right? It's not as common as it used to be, at least in some parts. And this dude was sort of like baffled, I guess, at this notion that we would be so proud to wave Mexican flags and we were in the army. And then when I asked him, hey, well, where are you from? He was like, oh, I'm from New Mexico. Oh, really? What part? I think he said Bernalillo. And I said, all right. And he's like, and then he asked me, why do y'all call yourselves Mexican? Aren't y'all Spanish like me? And I'm like, I was like, whoa, wait a minute. What happened there? And so he never, we would try to include this dude into our group, but he just never really like hit it off with us because he was
like the sad trombone from the Price is Right.
Yes, man. It was just really weird, It's like, dude, get with it, man. So that was my first introduction to this whole Hispano identity from, in a real like sense of knowing someone, not just reading it in a book.
Yeah, it's a trip. And, like we just covered, it happened for a reason. There was a historic reason why they adopted this identity and this fictional narrative, right? This racial fiction that they constructed to try to survive, right? To try to be accepted by the Anglos, the Americans. And okay, whatever, I get it. Now, I'm not going to judge these people for what they felt they had to do
survival
to survive, although some of these quotes were pretty ridiculous, like the guy that was like, we're Aryans.
Wait, what date was that from?
1915.
1915.
Yeah. And but it's 2021. We don't have to cling to this fantasy anymore, but it's so deeply embedded in this state, and it's reinforced through the schools, it's reinforced in the educational system. I never learned anything about like the legit influence that Mesoamerica had on the state of New Mexico until I was in college, and just
that's
really
pretty sad
diving into it. Like when I was in school, if somebody had told me in junior high in history class, on a cold winter morning, 2,000 Mexica and Tlaxcalteca warriors squared off against Pueblo warriors on the west side of Albuquerque, of what will become Albuquerque, that would have blown my mind. That would have made me so interested in the history of this place. When you consider that the name of the state that I live in, New Mexico, it has a Nahuatl name. The name of the state is in Nahuatl. The two oldest neighborhoods, the two oldest barrios, colonial barrios in New Mexico have Nahuatl names, Atlixco and Analco. And this is just erased, it's
well,
ignored.
You can still go to those places and see plaques. We've been there and taken pictures.
Yeah, but it's not promoted. It's like, if you didn't know that was there, you wouldn't learn about it in school. That's for sure.
Yeah.
It's not common knowledge.
What is it? Because it's been my understanding for a long time as well that a lot of people from southern Colorado, because before it was Colorado, it was still part of the New Mexico territory. And so a lot of those older settlements, the original ones before the Anglos came in, were part of that whole New Mexico tradition. So wasn't some of that sort of Hispano identity found in places like southern Colorado as well?
It could have been. Honestly, man, I don't remember it because, like I said, I grew up in the Chicano movement. So my parent, my mom and my uncles and my grandma, and my grandpa and my, aunts and cousins, none of us were using that word. We were all calling ourselves Chicanos. So
that's interesting.
It's nothing, even my grandma called herself a Chicana,
Wow.
So,
And I've done, maybe at some point, not in this episode, but we need to explore the term Chicano, right? Because there's a lot of ideas as to where it comes from. But one of the things that one of the ideas that I have encountered in my research, I believe that it's been a while since I looked at this. I believe it was Luis Leal, I believe, who did a paper in the late 1970s where he was doing sort of a linguistic analysis of the term, but not based on the one that we have come to know as far as stemming from Mexica, Mexicano, Chicano, right? Like that's kind of like the standard way that people understand the origin of the term. He was saying that it was a little bit more mundane than that. He was saying that it was a term that was sort of shortened from Mexicano when it was anglicized in the U.S. by Anglos, sort of using it as a way to demean Mexican people, especially people who were recent immigrants. And instead of calling them Mexicanos or Mexicanos, they would call them Chicanos. So it just over time the word slowly was contracted from Mexicano to Chicano. And so that's one way of understanding. So there's different ways of looking at the term. But what I'm trying to get at with this is that his research led him to conclude that the term Chicano originated somewhere along the border, but like near like El Paso and into the New Mexico area. And then it spread from there to Texas and to California and other parts of the Southwest. So it has a New Mexican origin, at least one of the interpretations of the word Chicano. And so, but that would be the southern part of New Mexico, not the northern part.
Yeah.
So then you also have that sort of dichotomy between the way that people in southern New Mexico perceive themselves in terms of identity as opposed to people from northern New Mexico in those older established colonial settlements.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when they were taking these statues down, you had a lot of these older Hispanos just up in arms, freaking out about it. And in Española, they had a big like entrada that they would celebrate, Juan de Oñate, and the city did away with it. Like they did away with an official, sponsorship of this event, and just whatever. If you guys want to do it as a private event, but the city's no longer going to be part of this. And I actually went up to observe the city council meeting where this was decided. And I shit you not, man, there were guys there dressed as Spaniards. Like,
you mean like in the getup with the whole knights and like armor and
no, like like the frill and the fringe, like blouses, like the loose fitting, blouses,
medieval commoners or something.
Yeah.
They were cosplaying the Renaissance fair or something.
Oh man, total cosplay. Like I had made so around the same time, it's funny you mentioned that. Around the same time, I created a meme and I took a photo of one of these guys dressed like a conquistador on his horse. And the meme said something like, when you don't know your history, you cosplay as white people.
Sounds about right.
And it's just a trip, because I'm seeing, I was for a while seeing less and less of it until the Oñate thing came, and it kind of like gave it a resurgence.
Right, because with genetics and all, I mean, hasn't some of that Hispano identity been retracted a little bit by some of these earlier, maybe not like loud proponents of it, but just ordinary people who just didn't think twice about it. They just understood who they were as Hispanos, and now after doing, DNA testing and ancestry.com and that sort of stuff, like the results come back and it shows that they have a significant amount of indigenous ancestry. And
and not only that, but their family records trace them back to Mexico, and they have indigenous ancestry from Mexico, right? So it's blowing a lot of people's minds, and it's good to see. So it's the DNA, people criticize the, DNA testing, whether that's a measure of identity, blah, blah, blah. But as far as I'm concerned, it's doing a good job in New Mexico of helping to expose this myth that the people here are like pure Spanish, or, you know, overwhelming. Because I always tell these guys, like, look, even genetically, you know, genetics doesn't matter as much as your cultural inheritance, right? What was the culture that your grandma passed down to you, or your grandpa? Like, what did you grow up doing that was intrinsically part of your being? And I grew up here, and I could tell you, man, I don't know the first fucking thing about Spain. You know, like, I don't know what Spanish is. I don't know the first thing about being Spanish. I'm a Chicano. I didn't grow up eating paella or, you know,
tortillas. You know, those Spanish tortillas.
Yeah, the Spanish tortillas and tamales and pozole, and, you know, all that Spanish stuff. So it's like we have this culture that is richly indigenous, and it's like, nah, that's not good enough.
But you know what's also weird about this whole Hispanic or Hispano fantasy heritage is that it's based on stories, like these fictional stories that were written by, I forget the name of this woman. There was several of them, but there's one that's credited for kickstarting the whole thing at the turn of the century, in the 19th century into the 20th. And these were white ladies that were writing, that were romanticizing the Southwest, that were romanticizing California and New Mexico, and they would, you know, do these, you know, hot novels that, you know, for their time, about these you know, Latin lover type, you know, these Spanish conquistador descendant, you know, hidalgos and whatnot.
Yeah.
And that's where the whole Hispanic or Hispano fantasy heritage comes from. It was invented by white women writing about hot Mexicans.
Well, I remember it wasn't too long ago. I forget who did the story, but there was a newspaper article, or maybe it was a TV sequence, but they were talking about how Mexican food became Spanish food in the Southwest. Do you remember that?
Yeah, it's
and
Spanish rice, and
it was like
really
a direct
Mexican
reaction to anti-Mexican racism, because all these Mexican restaurants had to change and say, oh no, we're Spanish restaurants, this is Spanish food. And it kind of, you know, it made it more presentable. It made it okay, you know. Well, at least they're not Mexicans. At least they're not
Mexican. They're Spanish. We still don't like the Spanish because they're kind of mongrelly too, but they're a little bit more acceptable.
Yeah, at least they're European.
Yeah. That is pretty much 2021 right there. Wow.
What's so gross, especially right now, man, to have that level of infighting, that level of criticism, when we've just come out of 4 years of one of the worst possible situations for indigenous people, you know, especially indigenous people from south of the border, who were demonized and dehumanized and infantilized by this shitbag of a former president. And we should be
united, forming coalitions. I hear a lot about this word called allies.
Something.
I mean, so the only allies are the ones that think like me? I mean,
I guess so.
That's not what an ally is.
You don't pass the ideological purity test, so we're not going to recognize you as an ally.
That's going to do us in the end. That's basically what happened with the Chicano movement. A lot of infighting, a lot of political. You had legitimate grievances, like a lot of the Chicanos and with the Chicano feminism, and a lot of the LGBTQ people who were also, you know, wanting to be represented. But beyond that, I mean, you had a lot of political infighting, a lot of backstabbing, a lot of instead of criticizing to make the movement better, it was criticized into oblivion. By the end of the 70s, you know, the Chicano movement is pretty much defunct at that point. And because of all the, I mean, I'm not saying that it was all because, but it played a huge role in the reason why the Chicano movement failed to really, accomplish a lot of the goals that a lot of people set out to do, whether it was individually or within groups, because there was just too much differences, too many ideological differences. And I fear that in today's age, we haven't learned that lesson from those old generations. We keep sort of repeating the same cycles over and over. And it's like I tell my students in my classes that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. That's why we're in history class. That's what I teach. I'm a history professor. And that's why we're here to learn history, not so that we don't repeat it, the old cliche of repeating the history, but so that we can learn from the past and do better in the future, in the now, right? And I don't think that we've really learned a lot of those lessons, especially if we're talking about like civil rights and progressive issues. We keep fighting the same issues all over again in different forms, but it's basically the same thing. I mean, if you synthesize it to the very core of what's being demanded, what's being fought for, whether it's police justice, immigration, unity among different ethnicities, respecting people who have different opinions, respecting people for who they are. We're still fighting the same issues that we were fighting 50, 60 years ago. I don't know. I mean, something's got to give, bro.
Thank you for listening to Tales from Aztlantis. We will see you again next episode. But until then, remember, the truth is like medicine. It doesn't always taste good, but it's always good for you. I'm your host, Kurly Tlapoyawa.
And I'm Ruben Ariano.
And we'll see you next time. Timoy Tase. Thank you for listening to Tales from Aztlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromaztlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timoy Tase.